Senator Bernie Sanders joined Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail and offered his endorsement for her presidential candidacy. But many of his millions of supporters are angry about that endorsement and feel betrayed. So the question remains, will Bernie's supporters show up for Mrs. Clinton in the fall? Or will they vote for the Libertarian ticket, Donald Trump, or just stay home? Let's talk about this with Kristen Soltis Anderson, columnist at the Washington Examiner and Republican pollster. She is also the author of the book, The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and How the Republicans Can Keep Up. Well, Kristen, social media has played such a huge role in Bernie's primary campaign. But now that social media beast might just be used against Mrs. Clinton. What are you looking at as we go forward in this general election campaign?
The irony of this election is that for all of the advice that I'd give any political candidate who wants to win over younger voters, saying, you need to use social media, this is where the world's going, Donald Trump, bizarrely enough, has been one of the savviest users of social media in this election. And part of what he does so well, for better or worse, is he uses it as a means to authentically communicate what he believes. People actually believe that's Donald Trump there sitting at, on the tarmac on his plane, typing stuff in on a phone. And so for Bernie Sanders, one of his benefits of why he's been so appealing to so many voters, particularly those millennial voters, is that authenticity, is that sense that every time Bernie Sanders gets up on stage and says something, it's coming from his heart and he really means it. And that's what a lot of people are looking for in this election.
It's an interesting quote about authenticity, Kristen, because so many people think social media is anything but actually authentic. Now, many Bernie supporters feel a bit betrayed by his endorsement, quite honestly, and are renewing the use of the Never Hillary hashtag. Is that something we're going to see trend? Because help me understand, what are those other key digital and tech trends for the rest of the 2016 cycle?
Well, for this Never Hillary movement, folks within the Democratic Party who are really heartbroken that Bernie Sanders isn't the nominee, I think the big question is going to be, do they stay together as a movement? Do they think that sitting out the election really is the best way to make their voice heard? Or by the time we get to November, has Hillary Clinton somehow been able to say, look, you may not love me, but I'm a lot better than Donald Trump. If she's able to pull that off and actually convince all of these Sanders supporters that, look, I may not be the best person for the job in your view, but I'm certainly better than the alternative, that's going to be the crux of her message. And even if you listen to Bernie Sanders' endorsement of Hillary Clinton the other day, for every nice thing he said about Hillary Clinton, he teed it up with something really nasty about Donald Trump to draw that contrast. Because I think he is aware, and I think Hillary Clinton is aware, that for these folks that have put so much trust and admiration in Bernie Sanders, that Hillary Clinton's not the same person, doesn't really hold all the same beliefs. And so she's really going to have to work to bring those supporters into her fold. And frankly, Donald Trump may be the best gift she could have been given on that front.
Well, that's a very interesting look at it, Kristen, because it seems that Democrats have been ahead of the GOP in using data and digital. But why is that?
Well, this is one of those things where the pendulum swings back and forth. So in the 2004 election, it was Republicans who were the best at this stuff. The Bush re-election campaign had a great digital effort. By the time you got to 2008, you had Democrats that had really leapfrogged where Republicans were excellent at using data, Facebook. During the 2010 election, with the rise of the Tea Party, Republicans got good at using Twitter. But still, there is this huge gap where Democrats are still much better at using these tools. Donald Trump, bizarrely enough, is using social media to amplify his message pretty significantly. The problem is that his message is not one that is tailored for the demographic groups that tend to be on social media. So while he's using Twitter effectively, he's not using it to perhaps win over these 18 to 29-year-old voters who are going to be so key. So this is yet another election where Republicans, I worry, are still a bit behind where the Democrats are. And in fact, you hear about the Clinton campaign having hundreds of staffers devoted to things like digital and data efforts, while the Trump campaign really has a skeleton crew and hasn't focused that much. I think if there is progress on the Republican side, it's going to come from candidates further down the ballot, folks running for Senate and governor's races and for Congress, that'll really have to be trying to build their own digital operations in the absence of one from the presidential level.
And it's interesting, Kristen, how you mentioned the demographics of social media, because it does come down to demographics. I know the Hillary Clinton campaign just recently brought on 3 people to deal with the millennial demographics that we're talking about. Now, in the primaries, Hillary was having an extremely difficult time with younger voters. Has that changed? Do you think it can change through a better, effective use of social media targeted towards them?
You know, whenever folks say, well, don't we need to use more social media to reach younger voters, I always like to point out that you have to have the right message in the medium. Just because you're using social media, if your message is really ineffective, you know, that, for instance, there was an attempt by the Clinton campaign a few months ago to say, tweet at us how you feel about student loan debt using 3 emojis. It was really silly. It was the sort of thing that just seems like somebody who's old trying to pander to millennials. So there are ways to try to use social media that sometimes fall flat. On the other hand, the other day, the Clinton campaign, responded to Donald Trump's tweet about how his use of the Star of David actually looked like something from a Frozen coloring book from, the Disney movie. And the Clinton campaign immediately tweeted back a joke, "Do you want to build a straw man?" Sort of making a really kind of funny play on a song from the movie. That's the right way to use social media. That's the kind of stuff that people will get a laugh at. They'll share it, they'll retweet it, and that'll put in front of them the Clinton campaign is sort of funny and thinks that Donald Trump is silly and is poking fun at him. That's an example of how to use it well. I don't think that Hillary Clinton is going to struggle with millennials in the general election as much as she did in the primary, because her opponent will be Donald Trump instead of Bernie Sanders, and it'll be a whole different pool of people who will be voting as well.
Well, what about the third-party candidates, Kristen, particularly the Libertarian Gary Johnson? How likely is he to scoop up the Bernie Sanders supporters, whether using social media or, as you mentioned so eloquently, message?
There's a really big opportunity there for Gary Johnson, or for, I think, anybody who's a third-party candidate. We are increasingly seeing voters say that they don't want all of column A or all of column B. They don't want to just be a Republican or just be a Democrat. They think there's too much baggage included in all of those labels. So for a lot of folks, they're choosing not to affiliate with the party or choosing to be independent. And for a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters, there's not a strong, perhaps, loyalty to the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders himself is, I think, an independent in the U.S. Senate who caucuses with the Democrats and is surely progressive and to the left politically. But, this idea that people are more and more often calling themselves independent, I think makes it slightly more likely that a third-party candidate can at least sort of make waves, if not become the president of the United States, at least complicate the math there a little bit. And if you think about it, Bernie Sanders is progressive on social issues. Gary Johnson and the Libertarians are progressive on social issues. On foreign policy, Bernie Sanders is perhaps more focused on restraint, not as hawkish. That's right where Libertarians are. They are not so sure we should be using military force. So it's really on just, I think, economic issues where you have a big difference between Libertarians and Bernie Sanders folks. But if they can bridge that divide or overcome that, that's 2 out of 3 major issue areas where there's some overlap.
And that's really within that overlap that people want to get to. And it's not just Hillary Clinton going after Bernie's supporters, and it's not just the Libertarians going after Bernie's supporters, but it's also Donald Trump going after Bernie's supporters. How effective do you think Donald Trump's bid for Bernie supporters that we've seen already, as will only ramp up during the general election, how effective will that be?
Well, there are a lot of voters out there who think that the system is rigged and that people who play by the rules and do the right thing can't get ahead in America anymore. Bernie Sanders supporters tend to feel that way. Now, overall, they think that it's corporations, big donors, big business who are rigging the system. But Donald Trump has not been shy about slamming the political system, slamming donors, slamming lobbyists, hitting some of those same populist notes. The problem will be that on, I think, a lot of those cultural issues, because so many Bernie Sanders supporters are a little more progressive, that's not exactly where Donald Trump is on certain things. But on trade and on, I think, economic issues, there is a surprising amount of overlap, and particularly some of these blue-collar folks that have found Bernie Sanders' message on things like trade or income inequality really appealing. Donald Trump thinks he's got an opportunity to peel folks off there.
How interesting, Kristen. It seems most generational groups grow more conservative as they get older. Do you see that happening with millennials?
I don't necessarily think it's going to be as likely to happen with millennials. With the baby boomer generation, a lot of them, when they first entered politics, it was right around the time of, you had Watergate happening, and so, started out pretty liberal, but then as they got older, did become conservative. But a lot of that was because the parties themselves were kind of realigning throughout the course of the boomers' lifetimes. For a lot of millennials, the things that we think of as making someone more conservative, becoming more religious, getting married, buying a home, living in a rural area, these aren't things that millennials are doing as often. And so as a result, all these things that might have made millennials grow more conservative as they got older, they're still living a lifestyle into their early to mid-30s that looks a lot more demographically like someone who votes on the left. So I don't think that it's a sure thing that Republicans can just sit back and wait and these millennials will all magically become Republicans one day. I think they need to start now conveying a message that talks to millennials where they're at with the lifestyle choices and the values that they're holding, instead of just waiting and hoping they become conservative down the road.
Well, and that ties right into the fact that, according to many press reports, Donald Trump's campaign has been plagued by disorganization and a lot of infighting. Do you sense his campaign realizes the importance of how you put it as message as it comes along with these millennial voters?
I don't think that the Trump campaign has really prioritized winning over millennial voters at this point. I think Donald Trump's electoral calculation is that he can win over older, white, working-class voters in Rust Belt states, places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and that's how he's going to put together enough electoral votes to become president. That may mean not focusing as much on younger voters, Latino voters, which, by the way, those are two demographic groups where there's a lot of overlap. Donald Trump's done a lot to alienate those kinds of voters and hasn't really built up any kind of message or infrastructure to reach out to them. So his strategy at this point seems to be run up the numbers with white voters, run up the numbers with older voters, and hope that it can offset the voters from other demographic groups, or at the very least, hope that they stay home because they're not as interested in coming out for Hillary Clinton. I think that's dangerous math on his part, and I think it's going to ultimately wind up backfiring in the end.
And you're right, it's mathematical, Kristen, it sure is. Do you have a prediction for November, Clinton or Trump?
Oh, gosh. Well, this is such an unpredictable year in so many ways. I mean, who'd have thought we'd be headed into the Republican convention with Donald Trump as the nominee, and there's not even potentially going to be a floor fight, that he's won it outright. But I think right now the polls certainly suggest that Hillary Clinton has an advantage. If you look at the Electoral College, there are enough states that Democrats have a pretty strong track record of winning over the last 6 presidential elections, that Republicans not only need to hold all of the red states that are already their turf, but flip a bunch of blue states. And that's going to be pretty hard when you see polls coming out of places like North Carolina that show Trump not necessarily holding the kinds of leads that he should, or losing states like Florida by margins significantly larger than what Mitt Romney lost them by. So it's going to be hard because Republicans are going to be playing defense in places they're not used to playing defense, offense in places they're not used to playing offense. It's kind of hard to see how he pieces together the electoral votes to win.
Well, I tell you, Kristen Soltis Anderson, you've shared some great information with us today. Thank you so much for your time.